Hello, everyone. Pastor Nick here. Wanted to come to you today for our midweek Bible study. I'm filming today in a slightly different location. I'm in Owensboro, meeting with the Kentucky Baptist Convention this week, and so I wanted to come and not neglect our time in God's Word. And so I want to invite you to find in your copy of God's Word 1 Samuel chapter 11. 1 Samuel chapter 11. As you make your way there, we will do as we have been doing, and then putting prayer requests in the Facebook post that this video is attached to, so that we can be praying for one another and sharing those prayer requests so that we can intercede on behalf of others who need it especially. So keep that in mind. 1 Samuel chapter 11 is where we're going to be, and it's a relatively brief chapter, but of enormous importance too. Because we have been studying Saul, of course, in the book of Samuel, but now the first king of Israel, Saul. And Saul has had a kind of inauspicious beginning. We've critiqued Saul a lot in terms of his leadership, and we'll have plenty of times to do that later again as well. But there are a few bright spots in his ministry, and chapter 11 is one of those bright spots in Saul's kingship. What we have in 1 Samuel chapter 11 is one of the first episodes of Saul's kingship that have brought a challenge to him, and one that he stepped up to the challenge very bravely and even exhibited grace under fire. So I want to detail those things for us. All the details are in these first 15 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 11. There came an enemy of Israel by the Ammonites. Nahash, the Ammonite. By the way, Nahash means snake in the original language. Nahash, the Ammonite, went up and besieged one of Israel's cities called Jabesh Gilead. Jabesh Gilead. And it says here in the first verse that all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a treaty with us, and we will serve you." So here you have almost an immediate surrender of the people in the town to the Ammonites. Just one of these things that they were willing to cut a deal instead of being conquered and everything that they have being plundered. And so verse 2, we find Nahash's terms. So look at that for a moment. "On this condition, I will make a treaty with you that I gouge out all your right eyes and thus bring disgrace on Israel." What a treaty, huh? To gouge out your right eye. I guess that's better than being slaughtered completely, but that's quite a sentence there for the terms. And so the elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days respite, that we may send messengers through all the territory of Israel. Then if there is no one to save us, we will give ourselves up to you." And so that's the counteroffer from the elders at Jabesh Gilead. Give us a little bit of time. Give us at least a sporting chance that somebody might come and help us. And Nahash is willing to take this deal because in the past, you'll find in the book of Judges a time or two where the Ammonites were attacking and nobody really helped some of these geographically isolated places. And so Nahash took the gamble and said, okay, you get 7 days. If nobody comes to help you, your eyes come out. So that's the situation that we have. That was also something perhaps wise on the part of the folks at Jabesh Gilead, because it posturing with that kind of potential surrender probably put Nahash and the Ammonites kind of off their guard. Like, okay, we're not really going to have to worry about this. We just got to wait a week and hang around until we take care of business. But why the eyes? That's interesting, isn't it? Well, why would the enemy want to gouge out their eyes? Well, a couple of things have come to mind in my time of studying here, and a couple of reasons surface that I want to point out to you. First of all, when it comes to the eyes, if you're able to take out somebody's eyes, it's going to limit them in terms of their ability to make war. All right, if they do the eyes, what happens? They are unable to make war. Your field of vision is cut in half. You're not able to have a whole lot of depth perception with just one eye. And so they would be almost useless on a battlefield. While at the same time, having one eye also made them a productive part of the society. They could still farm and produce food and work and those kinds of things. And so if the Ammonites were able to cripple a people by not letting them not make war, but also being able to work and to produce taxes and goods and services into their economy, then you get the best of both worlds. And so that may have been behind Nahash's thinking whenever they threatened to gouge out their right eyes. As you look in the next few verses, verses 5 through 11, we see the completion of, or the execution rather, of Jabesh Gilead's messengers going out to the rest of Israel, seeing if anybody would help them. And the message eventually came to where Saul was. Saul was in a field, coming back from a field, following some oxen. Again, just sort of humble beginnings there for Saul, not what you would imagine a king would be doing. But as he hears the news of what is happening at Jabesh Gilead, verse 6, and I want to read this because it's important. The Spirit of God rushed upon Saul when he heard these words, and his anger was greatly kindled. Now, the Spirit of God had rushed on him whenever he heard these things. So this is a remarkable event for a couple of reasons. Number one, it does tell us something about the necessity of God's Spirit for successful leaders and for leaders who are going to be faithful to the Lord. And we know from Saul, studying him thus far, aside from being tall and having the appearance of a leader, it seems a little slow pickup on trying to execute as a leader. But here the Spirit of God helps him in a way that's going to be very productive for him and for Israel as well. So the Spirit of God is important from a leadership perspective, in that the Spirit of God has the energizing power when it falls on a person or a people or even on a church to go out and do great things for God. So that's one of the things to think about when we think about the Spirit of God. The other thing about the way that Samuel uses the Spirit of God here is that most of the time in the Old Testament, you're going to find them saying the Spirit of the Lord, which is the Spirit of Yahweh. And so using just the Spirit of God, the Spirit of El, is unusual. Only 2 times do we find it happening in the Hebrew part of the Scriptures in the Old Testament, and this is one of those times. So it's most of the time when God does something really great, you find him associated here with the Spirit of the Lord falling on a person or animating a person's activity. But here it is the Spirit of God, almost as if it's a little bit less than the Spirit of the Lord, which is the personal covenant name of Yahweh. And so, again, we see a sort of a spiritual separation, if you will, between Saul and the covenant Lord, Yahweh. And so here it's a very small distinction, but the Spirit of God falls on him, not the Spirit of Yahweh. And that's certainly not 2 different people, God and Yahweh, but it does communicate something about the character and the importance of those features in just the name. So that's something to consider as you're reading this. But here Saul, as a result of the Spirit of God, becomes angry. And so what he did, to make sort of a longer story short, is he was able to motivate the Israelites to come and to help and to gather around his leadership and Samuel's to be able to defeat the enemy. Verse 7 says, the last part of verse 7 says, whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. So he was using this illustration where he had slaughtered some oxen and used it as an example to the people to motivate them. Listen, if you don't come and help, this is what's going to happen to your oxen. All right, so talk about a positive motivator, right? The people were terrorized in that sense, but it worked. It worked. He was able to gather of the men of Israel 300,000 and the men of Judah 30,000. And so that's a pretty significant army to come up against the Ammonites. It was a mighty thing to behold, that number of people. And so they send out word to Jabesh Gilead ahead of their coming and fighting the Ammonites. The word was in verse 9, thus shall you say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you shall have salvation. And that was the message from Saul to the people of Jabesh Gilead, saying, we're going to help you. So you can imagine the excitement in Jabesh Gilead and what's going to take place. The men of Jabesh said in verse 10, tomorrow we will give ourselves up to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you. In other words, whatever you say, we're all in if you're going to protect us. And the word that salvation has come really motivated them. And so Saul organized the 300,000 and the 30,000 into 3 companies. If they were equal companies, they would have been 110,000 men in each. And was able to slaughter the Ammonites. It says in verse 11 that they came in the midst of the camp in the morning watch. The morning watch would have been anywhere between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. So this would have been early morning. This would have been probably sleeping time for the Ammonites. So it was a surprise attack as far as that goes. And what verse 11 says that they essentially slaughtered them. They struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. So sometime between 2 and 6 a.m. is where they began the battle. The heat of the day, hottest part of the day, right? Sometime around noon or after or somewhere along that line. And it says, and those who survived were scattered, that is the Ammonites, so that no 2 of them were left together. So that's a pretty remarkable percentage and remarkable defeat on the part of Saul. And so after this, you can imagine Saul's reputation begins to grow. You may recall back in chapter 10, after Saul was anointed by Samuel, and they were gathered around the people, some of the people were criticizing the selection of Saul, saying, well, whose father is this? In other words, who is Saul? Why is he so important? Why did he get chosen for this role? Well, as Saul's popularity increased, what happens sometimes? Sometimes those who find themselves on the opposite side of this political situation anyway, the critics of them, are targeted. We find that here in 1 Samuel chapter 11. I dare say you find that today as well in other contexts. But look what verse 12 says. The people said to Samuel, who is it that said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death. All right? And so this kind of censoring of political speech is quite remarkable. And we have an example of it here in the early parts of the Bible in the Old Testament here in 1 Samuel. So know that even that kind of censorship of political speech, and they wanted these people who were critics of Samuel at the beginning to be canceled, to be doxxed. But how does Saul respond? This is what really shows us grace under fire, and an example for any leader who might be dealing with critics or struggling in some way with somebody else, Saul said in verse 13, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." Now that's quite a statement too, because he's going against a lot of the people who are very glad that he is king now and glad to see this kind of victory that's occurred. And so Saul is saying, put away your swords. All right, let's celebrate the fact that the Lord has given us victory. All right, this is not a day for death. This is a day of grace and of thankfulness. And that's exactly what Saul is doing here. It reminds me a little bit in the New Testament, the principle that Jesus had taught not to retaliate, to turn the other cheek, to show forgiveness and to show mercy in that way. And so that's the principle I think is being taught here in 1 Samuel. Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingdom." And so they went, even in the midst of his popularity, to go and what they said, renew the kingdom. And so Samuel was there. He had told them, let's renew the kingdom. So they went there to Gilgal, and they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. Now, of course, he'd been anointed, and he had been chosen by God. God enlightened Samuel to his choice, and he was going to do that. But here, whatever ceremony this looked like, whatever took place, this was another officiating part of recognition that Saul indeed was the king over Israel. And so there it says, there they sacrificed peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So I hope that this brief passage here in 1 Samuel 11 can teach us something a little bit about leadership and the importance of the Spirit of God and the presence of God on our lives as believers in Jesus. That if we are to make disciples of all the nations, if we are to be engaged in the work of evangelism together as a church and equipping one another, to do any of that apart from the Spirit of God is going to be impossible. And so we need to be a people that make sure that we are praying regularly, persistently, and beseeching the Lord and asking for His favor in that way, and making sure that the Lord gets all the glory and the honor and the praise and not to us. And then also to really see Saul's demonstration of grace here. It's one of these rare episodes in Saul's kingdom that he does some really remarkable things. And this chapter represents that. And to show that kind of grace, Saul could have very easily had his enemies executed. He could have easily had his enemies canceled in that way, but he didn't. He chose to focus on what the Lord had done and leading his people not to kill, but to give thanks. And that ought to be a lesson for us today too, especially as we treat our neighbors and those who differ from us and those that maybe even don't like us, that we share the grace of God and we point people to thanksgiving to God for all He's done. God bless you. Hope you've been able to gain something from this passage, and I look forward to seeing you again as the Lord allows.